I want to talk about the German Self-Determination Act, which is called Selbstbestimmungsgesetz in Germany and passed on the 12th of April 2024. I want to talk about the prehistory first, about the German Transsexuals Act. After Sweden, Germany was one of the first countries in Europe to enable the legal fiction of sex change through a transsexual law in 1981. The decisive factor was a judgment by the Federal Constitutional Court in 1978, which ordered the legislator to create a regulation on the basis of human dignity and the fundamental right to free development of the personality. This case was a grown-up man who had crushed one of his testicles and afterwards had his genitals surgically removed and came to believe he was a woman from birth on and had taken his case to the Constitutional Court in Germany. The court decided that he was allowed to falsify his sex entry in the birth register and register a female name. Since 1st January 1981, the Transsexuals Act came into law in Germany. Since then already, men and women in Germany have been able to apply for a change of name via the minor solution. And there also was a major solution for the change of civil status, and the sex entry in the birth register was also changed. Even at the time, this law was controversial, as the CDU, the conservatives in particular, foresaw that this legal fiction would cause many problems. As today, however, the liberals, the FDP, and the SPD, the Social Democrats in particular, praised it as the most progressive law in Europe, and even then had plans to extend this legislation to the EU. Women's rights, which are fortunately enshrined in Article 3 of the German Constitution and are in conflict with the transsexual law, were ignored. The argument was always that it is such a tiny minority. The first prerequisites for the Great Solution were initially to no longer feel to belong to the birth entry and to have been under compulsion to live according to their ideas for at least 3 years. A high probability that the feeling of belonging to the opposite sex will no longer change. They had to be at least 25 years old. They had to sterilize themselves, and they had to undergo a surgical procedure to change their external sexual characteristics. They also had to be divorced. Then the trans activists in Germany went through several court cases and softened the law. And the age limit of 25 years was deleted. Then the sterilization was no longer required. Also, the gender reassignment treatment was no longer required. And divorce also was no longer necessary to change the sex entry. There were only a few conditions remaining. This was 2 independent expert opinions that had to establish that the person feels that they belong to the opposite sex, that they had been under pressure to live in accordance with these ideas for at least 3 years, and there is a high probability that their sense of belonging to the opposite sex will no longer change. They also had to confirm it by a legal court, and they had to pay for it themselves. The costs were approximately 2,500 euro, but they could be covered by legal aid. Since 2017, Germany also had a third sex entry, diverse, for people with an intersex condition. It protects the gender identity of persons who feel that they neither belong to the male or female sex. So they had already fantasy in the law in Germany. Since 2020, this entry has even been possible for people with an alleged non-binary gender identity via the transsexual law after an assessment. Trans activists have labeled all these assessments as unreasonable, agonizing, and humiliating, and claim that they are unconstitutional. However, this is not true, as the Federal Constitutional Court ruled in 2017 that an assessment is still reasonable, and the claim to change the sex entry was rarely rejected. So the German transsexual law was already, therefore, very, very liberal. Now I want to talk about the self-determination law. Since 2014, trans activists lobbied German politics, especially in the family and women's ministry. In 2017, the Greens delivered a first draft of a self-ID law. In 2020, the Liberals and the Greens delivered two separate drafts to push through a self-determination law based on the Yogyakarta principles in Germany. In 2021, an initial bill was rejected in parliament by the grand coalition of CDU, the Conservatives, and SPD, the Social Democrats at the time. In autumn 2021, the traffic light coalition was voted from SPD, the Social Democrats, Greens, and Liberals, and they promised in their coalition agreement that they would implement a self-determination law as soon as possible. The first queer commissioner of Germany, Sven Lehmann, promised from the outset that it would be passed very quickly. However, with combined forces and many actions, protests, letters to politicians, and raising awareness among the public and the press, we were able to delay it until April 2024. So 3 years. The actual passing of the law was announced at very short notice and just a few days before the deadline at 12th April 2024. It was scheduled for a Friday lunchtime when the Bundestag is usually particularly empty. And the votes were 374 votes in favor, 251 against, and 11 abstentions. So we had only a lead of 10 votes. We also had a very short protest at this day organized, and about 100 people came from all over Germany to protest against the law. If we would have had more time, a lot more people would have come. So this German self-determination law is, in my view, one of the most permissive and dangerous self-ID laws in Europe. As Germany serves as a role model for other EU states, it is to be feared that other EU states will also be pressured to follow the German example. Austria has already shown corresponding endeavors. Any protection against abuse has been removed from the law that was passed. For example, the Federal Criminal Police Office and the Ministry of Interior had enforced that an official check of the person should take place when a change of sex entry is requested. They then launched a petition against it, which was signed by many well-known female authors, influencers, queer ideologues, and women's organizations in Germany. They called for distrust and discrimination to be removed from the law, and for genuine self-determination to be made possible. Afterwards, they deleted the official check of a person. So I show you some details of the Self-Determination Act. Any man can declare himself a woman and change his first name by making a simple declaration at the registry office without any checks. The change of sex entry does not have to be permanent, but may be changed once a year. Also, the first name may be changed once a year. Different entries are possible at choice. Male, female, diverse, no entry. These are used for people who want to change a sex entry from female to male or male to female. People who want a diverse sex entry, people with variants of sex development, aka intersex, or non-binary, without presenting any certificates. And people who do not want a sex entry, non-binary, for example. However, none of the four parties will undergo any kind of verification in the form of an expert opinion. If a person's gender entry and first names have been changed in the civil status register, they may request that entries relating to their gender and first names be changed in official registers. The fantasy gender non-binary is thus declared a legal fact in the Self-Determination Act. Parents can determine the gender is the sex entry of their children themselves from babyhood, from age 0. From the age of 5, children should declare to the registrar that they agree to the change of sex entry. They are thus declared capable of giving consent from the age of 5. From the age of 14, adolescents may decide on their own sex entry. However, parental consent is required. If the parents do not agree, a family court can be called to override the parents' veto. For separated parents, there is a risk that the parent who refuses to change the sex entry will lose custody. The minor must declare that they have received counseling, but they don't have to prove it. And in the case of minors, the sex entry may be changed at any time. A prohibition on disclosure prohibits the naming of a person's sex and former name. This prohibition now also applies to family members in the adopted law. The intention is decisive there. Anyone who does not name the sex and former name with the intention of causing offense and in a friendly manner is to remain unpunished. Anyone who violates the ban on disclosure will face a fine of up to 10,000 euros. Quotas for women are cancelled. Gender identity, not sex, is decisive for women's quotas now. In the event of war, men may not declare themselves to be women and will be drafted as men. On the birth certificate of newborns, the gender entry of the parents at the time of birth is taken into account, not the sex. Instead of father or mother, the neutral formulation parent can be entered there. In the case of legally incompetent persons, for example, mentally disabled adults, the carers decide on the gender entry. However, a local court is also involved here. Sex-based rooms, women's rooms, women's shelters, women's prison, and women's sports should only be able to maintain in individual cases via domestic and owners' law and the General Equal Treatment Act in Germany. So, some possible consequences of this irresponsible legislation: arbitrary changes of the sex entry of babies and young children by their parents or guardians will make it easier to conceal the identity of these children. This can be used for child abuse and child trafficking. Parents could use the loophole of changing the sex entry of their child at will to carry out female genital mutilation on baby girls for religious reasons. This is because the circumcision of boys is permitted in Germany for religious reasons. Babies and small children are no longer protected from the fictional worldviews of their parents and guardians. The draft does not contain any regulations on sex reassignment surgery, but lays the foundations. Giving even small children the idea that they can change sex paves the way for physically invasive measures. By defining non-binary as a gender identity, this target group will presumably be prepared for elective surgery and hormone administration, as health insurance in Germany have so far not paid for mastectomies for women who declare themselves to be non-binary. Adults who are legally incompetent, for example, mentally disabled people, are also at the mercy of their carers' ideas about their gender identity. Quotas for women are a thing of the past in Germany. This also means that the function of an equal opportunities officer, previously reserved for women, who are supposed to ensure the implementation of Chapter 3 of the German Basic Law, the Equal Rights for Women, is no longer necessary. Women's prisons have been de facto abolished in Germany. Since a women's prison can only refuse a man who identifies as a woman on grounds of discrimination in individual cases, a man can be transferred to a women's prison at his request. This is already happening. Experimental hormone treatments and plastic surgery for these offenders in prison are already financed by the general public in Germany. At the end of his sentence, the man can change his gender entry back to man. This is already happening in Germany. In women's sport, too, the decision as to whether a man may participate in a women's team is deferred to the sports club. If the club refuses, the man could sue his way onto the team via the General Equal Treatment Act. The prohibition of disclosure creates an additional hurdle in these conflicts, as a man may not be addressed as a man. Since women are liable to prosecution if they name the sex of a man who has changed his sex entry, they can no longer defend themselves against the presence of a man in previously sex-specific spaces. No woman knows whether a man has changed his sex entry. A man can therefore simply walk into these rooms and claim this. After all, he no longer has to make any changes to his external appearance. This creates a chilling effect for girls and women. Previously safe spaces become spaces of fear. The legislator knows who a man is in the event of war. However, it gives men 2 months to change their gender entry before a possible armed conflict. A man with a dual nationality can be registered as a man in Spain and as a woman in Germany. There are no rules for sex-based statistics, for example, violence and crime statistics. It is therefore to be expected that these statistics will no longer be meaningful in the future and, above all, will conceal the predominantly male perpetrators. Since there is no longer any verification before a change of civil status, offenders can use this law to change their identity at will. So the law is set to come into force on 1st November 2024. A change of sex entry can already be requested on 1st August 2024. The law will go through the Federal Council again. It is not already through. It will go through the Federal Council again on 17th May, but does not require approval. We now have the situation that the Committee on Internal Affairs has submitted a request to convene a mediation committee to resume the regulation according to which registration authorities had to inform the Federal Criminal Police Office, the Federal Police, the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, and various other federal authorities about the change of gender entry of a person before the change of sex entry and change of first name. They speak of a considerable threat to internal security if the law is passed in this form. But the Family and Youth Committee and the Legal Affairs Committee still do not see any problems. The issue of security for women and children is not being taken seriously, despite warnings from many quarters. If the request to convene a mediation committee is successful, the law will go back to Bundestag. But we don't expect that, as the leading committee is the Family and Youth Committee. As the law is unconstitutional in several points, for example, regarding women's rights for equality, or regarding freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and academic freedom, or regarding several children's and parents' rights, we try to convince the CDU, the Conservatives, or the Bavarian government to file an abstract action for a judicial review. We also try to convince the President of Germany to not sign the law. If the law comes into force, we are considering a constitutional complaint. The transgender activists of Germany also consider a constitutional complaint, as the self-determination in their eyes goes not far enough. They want to delete the domestic authority for women's shelters, women's saunas, or women's sports. And they claim to be discriminated on the basis of the General Equal Treatment Act. They also want to lower the age of consent for minors and abolish the consent of parents. The only positive aspect is that with a self-determination law, the German Transsexuals Act has been abolished. If we are successful in having the Self-Determination Act declared unconstitutional by the Federal Constitutional Court, both the Transsexuals Act and the Self-Determination Act could become a thing of the past. This is our only hope. Thank you.